Okay, everyone. Hello, everybody at home and here in person. I am Madeline Crispell. I am the museum's curator, and I am so very happy to introduce you all this evening, this very dusty evening, to Water Street to the Red River, Chicago and the Civil War Navy, from Joe Gamble, one of the museum's very own volunteers. Now, every third Friday of every month, we have a lecture here at the Maritime Museum. If you like what you see tonight, you can always come next month in person or watch online. Next month's program will be from the historian Larry McClellan, and it will be about the Underground Railroad on the Great Lakes. But this evening, we have the distinct pleasure of listening to Joe Gamble. Joe, like I said, is an interpreter and volunteer here with the Chicago Maritime Museum. He helps us out a lot with school groups, other interpretation. Sometimes he is here dressed as a French voyageur. He is also an associate at the Bridgehouse Museum, and he shares a distinction that I've so far not met any other docent besides myself to have, which is he's also been mistaken for a ghost before. Twice. Well, I'm so very happy. Put your hands together for Joe Gamble.
Hello, everyone. Picking up there. Okay, so a little bit of background here. So this particular research topic, it came to me in a dream. No. So as Madeline mentioned, so sometimes I volunteer here at the Maritime Museum. Last summer, I believe it was, I was volunteering. I was manning the front desk one afternoon, and a lady came in. She lived on the north side of Chicago, had never been here before, never heard of the museum before, and she had begun doing her family research, her genealogy. And she found out that she had a third great grandfather who apparently had been a ship captain in Chicago. Knew nothing about him, nothing other than that, and so wondered if we could possibly help, we being the maritime experts on the city of Chicago. So I told her, go on through, give me a name, I'll see what I can dig up. I went through some newspaper records, what I could do quick, found out, sure enough, he was a ship captain. He owned a lumber schooner, classic story of 1860 Chicago. And then as I was looking through these newspapers, I kept finding accounts of him that showed or made mention of him involving something called the Seamen's Benevolent Society. So I had to immediately go and do a little digging. What was the thing? As it turns out, this was, to the best of my knowledge, the very first true maritime sailors union formed in the United States. And it was incorporated right here in Chicago in March of 1860. That led me down another research rabbit hole. How long did this thing last? What all did it do? Et cetera, et cetera. And as my occasionally Wikipedia brain does, that led me into other things. In newspapers in the Chicago Tribune and the Inter-Ocean throughout 1861 to 65, there were lots of references to the Seamen's Benevolent Society in obituaries. And these obituaries were of men from Chicago who were serving currently in the United States Navy, killed in action at Forts Henry, Fort Donelson, at Vicksburg. They were serving in the Western Gunboat Fleet. They were Chicago sailors, and they were members of this union. They were sent home, and their union mates acted as their pallbearers. And I kept finding these listings, and once again, that led me down the rabbit hole in question of exactly how many Chicagoans served in the Navy during the Civil War. And if anyone here has studied the Civil War to any great detail, you're better at it than I am. I am fair warning, I am not a Civil War historian. My father absolutely is, but I focus on the 18th century. But there is a lot of published documentation about Chicagoans in the Civil War United States Army. The famous Chicago Board of Trade Battery Field Artillery, many volunteer regiments, all were formed. These have been written about quite often in the last several decades. I couldn't find a whole lot about Chicago and the U.S. Navy, and that little part of my brain that was an academic historian began screaming undone research. And so that led me to this moment. So you guys are my guinea pigs actually putting forth my research such as it is. So thank you for putting up with me. So to begin, figure out how to click this. To begin, In the beginning of the American Civil War, or as my father always calls it, the War of the Rebellion, very quickly, the U.S. government has to come up with a plan of how to fight, stop, contain, end this rebellion. And the general plan put forward by Commander of the Armies Winfield Scott is the Anaconda Plan, as it comes to be known. A great encirclement. We will blockade all of the southern ports, and if possible, we will divide the southern states in half using the Mississippi River. If we can control the Mississippi River, you can divide Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas, Missouri from the rest of the southern states, and then you can take them out piecemeal. However, in order to actually make this plan come to a reality, you have to control that river. And to control the Mississippi, you have to control its mouth, and you have to control many of its tributaries. So I'll come back to this map periodically. So let's talk a little bit about the U.S. Navy as it existed pre-war. So this is a photograph from during the war in 1863. The USS Richmond was a screw sloop, as they're commonly known. This is the standard type of naval vessel the U.S. Navy has employed in the 1850s into the early 1860s. These are ocean-going craft. They are both sail and steam powered. And primarily, the U.S. Navy is entirely ocean going and entirely on patrol or academic duty. This basically means that you have constant coastal surveys that are I was about to say, I'm giving it feedback. There we go. It worked. That'll never happen again. Where was I? Right. Yes. Nautical things. Oh, and by the way, your phones may be going off periodically. It doesn't matter to me. It's been happening to all of us. So these screw sloops are designed to patrol the oceans of the world. The U.S. Navy has multiple squadrons, as they call them. You have the famous North Atlantic Squadron. You have the Caribbean Squadron, a few that are basically doing coastal surveys, mapping charts, shoals, reefs, occasionally doing scientific explorations to the Antarctic, this sort of thing. And you also have one squadron that is operating off the western coast of Africa, patrolling for slave ships. At this time, the U.S. Navy pre-Civil War did not have a rank above that of captain. The rank of admiral did not exist. Basically, if a squadron was to be formed, the most generally senior captain would be determined a flag officer who would then be in charge of the other captains and whatever the mission happened to be. The Civil War will change a lot of things with the U.S. Navy, leading to a much larger Navy, and of course the introduction of commodores and admirals and fleets, etc. The sailors of the U.S. Navy, by and large, are all, if they were American born, they were generally all from eastern seaboard maritime communities. The only U.S. naval recruiting stations we had were on major ocean-going ports, such as New York, Boston, Portsmouth, Norfolk, Charleston, and New Orleans. Excuse me. That is where these men came from. If they were not native born, they were sailors from England, from Ireland, etc., who had made their way here via merchant navies, who decided to enlist in the U.S. Navy and began that career. This is generally what the U.S. Navy looks like by the time we begin this conflict. Now, if you will note, a large ocean-going vessel is not good at going up a river. So special craft are needed and special modes of transport are needed. So anyone here from St. Louis? So you may recognize the name of Eads. So James Buchanan Eads is an entrepreneur of the 1850s. Mr. Eads basically becomes the modern version of a billionaire in his 30s, basically by filling a niche in the market, which is if you have a lot of boats on rivers, those boats sink. And so he came up with a way to salvage those wrecks. Pictured on the right is his famous submarine number 7. Submarine meant something entirely different in those days. This is essentially a salvage vessel. It is a catamaran design with a large crane on it, basically so that you could raise a vessel, raise parts of it, and you could salvage these steamboats that have run aground, that have burned, exploded, or sank in the Mississippi River and its tributaries. So with the design of his submarine number 7 and a few of his other boats, he basically designed a very heavy ship that still had a relatively shallow draft, meaning it could go in shallower water. So Mr. Eads also had the good fortune to be very good friends with President Abraham Lincoln, as well as the U.S. Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles. So when the war breaks out, and Winfield Scott proposes his Anaconda plan, the Army and the Navy sort of talk to each other and put their heads together. How can we actually make this happen? Very quickly, as I mentioned, they need to figure out how do we control the rivers, particularly the Mississippi, but all of its tributaries. These ships that I just showed, like these screw sloops, are absolutely not capable of going any further north of maybe Vicksburg, Mississippi. Even then, it was dangerous. They definitely can't get up the Cumberland River or the Red River, etc. So we have to design an entirely new type of naval warship to fight on rivers. Enter Mr. Eads. Mr. Eads proposes to his good friend that they use his shipyards at Carondelet outside St. Louis, and he works together. He really jumped the gun here. He worked with a U.S. Navy lieutenant with the unfortunate last name of Pook, Samuel Pook. And these ships later on will become known as Pook's Turtles. Basically, what he proposes is a design based off of his submarine number 7. It will be a semi-catamaran design. It will be armored, that is an ironclad gunship. We're talking before the Monitor and the Merrimack. That will happen a couple years later. Basically, he comes up with this design in joint. And the plan is to build them at Carondelet, at Louisville, and in Cincinnati. And they basically commission 9 of these ships. And he promises the president that he will have his ships in 6 months. He only misses the deadline by about 10 days. But basically, if the Navy will provide the guns, he will provide the ships, and if they will pay him handsomely. And that is exactly what happens. The shipyards at Carondelet, at Louisville, and Cincinnati begin work right away on these ships. Every carpenter, every mechanic, every blacksmith shop in the vicinity of St. Louis is brought into work on these ships in 1861. And they're finally, for the most part, finished in September of 1861. And they're all named after cities, mostly the ones where they're built, the USS Cairo, the Louisville, the St. Louis, the Carondelet, etc. And they become known as the city-class ironclads. Give me a sec. That is the USS Cairo. All of these are sister ships. What you have here is a very large ironclad gunboat. The ironclad, the iron plating is 3 inches thick on the front armor, slanted at 33 degrees. They tested this with live fire on a sandbar outside St. Louis and almost killed the gunners because the shell ricocheted back at them. But the USS Cairo, I love this photo. The USS Cairo later on would actually sink by a mine near the Yazoo River and was mostly completely razed in the 1960s and is now in the museum at Vicksburg, Mississippi. Fantastic site if you get the chance to go and take a look. But these are the bulk of what will become known soon as the Western Gunboat Fleet. So I mentioned the way the U.S. Navy was set up pre-American Civil War was to, if you have a mission that you need more than one ship, you corral multiple ships together, multiple captains, and you name one flag officer who's in charge of the operation. This is a completely new type of thing. You're not just patrolling for slave ships. You're not blockading a port. You have to have a fleet that is able to know its newfound terrain. None of these naval officers really are familiar unless they're from this area, and most of them are not. They have to be familiar with inland American waterways. They have to know how to navigate rivers. They have to know about the flow. They have to know about the seasonal change to these rivers. And so a whole new mode of thinking has to develop. Another thing here is I mentioned at the outset that the U.S. Navy and the United States Army do not really like to talk to one another. This continues, but this whole operation will be the first true time in American history that those two branches are forced to work together. And in fact, you will actually see the largest amphibious operation prior to the Second World War takes place outside of Vicksburg, Mississippi. So going back one more, this is actually the slips and one of the, they called them tin-clads. So the City class ironclads are your big gunboats. They had lesser armored faster ships that they called tin-clads, and then others that simply had wooden armor. But this is Mound City, Illinois, right next to Cairo. If you can envision on a map, the very tip of Illinois, right where it comes into the Mississippi and the Ohio, that was the primary naval base for this Western Gunboat Squadron as it came to be known. So to get into it, with these newfound ships and a newfound commander, a Captain Andrew Foote, who was declared flag officer. Andrew Foote primarily it was referred to that he was a very good captain of academic expeditions. He was a scholar. He was a good naval commander, but they viewed he wasn't quite as forceful as what was needed. And so he was replaced shortly after, not because he failed, but because he wasn't the right guy. But this naval warfare is unique in American history, but it's also unique in the Civil War. So if anyone here has often heard the term an ironclad, we get this idea in our mind primarily of the Battle of Hampton Roads, this very famous incident we talk about. It changes naval warfare. It's the first time that two ironclads face off against one another, the Monitor versus the Merrimack. You have these two very experimental ship designs, and they basically come out and they circle around each other and fire and put dents in each other's armor, and neither can really defeat the other. And so it's a draw. And we think of this changes naval warfare forever. And part of that may be true, but what you see in these Western waters is something far more experimental. You have ironclads that are just as powerfully armed and armored as the Monitor and Merrimack. They're often, other than the Mississippi, they're working in very narrow spaces. You also have a myriad of support ships. So the Confederacy has to counter this in some way, and they don't have the same amount of iron. They did build ironclads, although many of them never actually made it into service. Instead, what they did was use private river like steamboats that were fast, that were agile. They would put some armor, some guns, and they would fit them with a ram. And so this depiction on the right is from the naval battle that takes place off the coast of Memphis, Tennessee. And this is a wild affair where you have a whole fleet of Confederate ram ships, and then about 3 of these massively armored and armed Union gunboats with their own ram ships that are basically maneuvering around, firing at each other point blank range, ramming another ship, pushing it onto a sandbar, another one sinking over here. It's this incredibly wild and chaotic affair, all while the good citizens of Memphis are standing on the bluffs watching it happen with their picnics. So this is typical of a lot of these actions. The other thing I'll point out on this map on the right, so as the fleet begins moving to actually take its, they basically start at Illinois and you work your way down. So if you can envision again, I can go back, the Mississippi River comes down, and a lot of these rivers, its tributaries especially, they curve wildly. So when you think of naval warfare and the tactics you do, it's not just open ocean. You have these horseshoe bends and rivers and twists and turns and islands and oftentimes bluffs on either side. The Confederacy was very good at these defensive operations where they would find a huge bend in the river and they would put artillery fortifications and emplacements up on the bluffs where they could fire down onto any ship. And then if there was an island in the area, they would fortify it as well. So any ship that is coming down the river can be pounded by artillery from multiple angles and multiple directions. This is incredibly good defense. And it's not something that these gunboats, armored though they were, could counter easily by themselves. So almost from the beginning, you have the first case of true Army, Navy interoperations, where you have this fleet of gunboats that are maneuvering downriver, followed by a train of transport ships hauling soldiers, that when all of a sudden you round the bend of a river and get, saluted with a volley of artillery fire, the gunboats have to paddle wheel back around the bend, offload their soldiers, who then come around. The gunboats then in formation come around the bend, taking the fire, pummeling them back, drawing the attention as the Army moves their way up to actually knock them out. So working together in tandem. And Admiral Porter, who replaces Admiral Foote and will pretty much be in command for the rest of the war, works very well with his commanders. And in 1862 and early 1863, he's primarily working with two men, and that would be William Tecumseh Sherman and General Grant. Now, General Grant, as we all know, is another Illinoisan. Grant truly gains the fame that we know because of these joint operations. Forts Henry and Fort Donelson on the Tennessee River are two major forts on the riverways that the Army is trying to move into Tennessee. Those forts are taken because of the Navy and the Army working together. It's where these gunboats prove their worth, and Grant gains his famous nickname of Unconditional Surrender Grant, U.S. Grant. Later on, he will famously take Vicksburg, arguably the most important victory for the United States in the war that seals the fate of the Mississippi River and in turn the Confederacy. It's because of working with these gunboats in tandem. Another thing I'll mention in this riverine warfare, there's a good depiction off of Memphis. That's them, again, firing from the bluff. And there's a lot of accounts of these gunboats. They were well armored on the front and some on the sides. They were not well armored on the top. And so there's a lot of occasions where the Confederates would use what they call plunging fire, where you fire down, where the U.S. gunboats can't actually train their guns high enough to return. It's also worth noting in this pretty much the first era of steamboat warfare, you don't just have to worry about getting hit by a cannonball and splinters. One of the big deals is if that cannonball penetrates the armor and hits the boiler. If the boiler explodes, it will burn and scald everyone inside. So these ironclads, they actually have to armor themselves. They have to armor the paddle wheels to prevent them from being shot away. And they have to put extra armor inside around the boilers to prevent them from being shot. The Union Navy also begins taking lessons from the Army and siege techniques, and Admiral Porter commissioned several what he refers to as his mortar rafts. You see them on the right there. That same map I showed where you have these bends in the river and around which is a nasty Confederate fortification. He found that he could find those with his gunboats and then have one of them pull back and then bring up these mortar barges, post them behind the river bend, lob shells over the bend in the river down into the Confederate position and soften it so that the gunboats and the soldiers could then move up. So much like World War I later on, technology is advancing, but people are actually learning and adapting with that environment. So that being said, who actually made up this fleet? If we go back to 1861, and you now have all of these new things are coming to fruition with the U.S. war plan, the Anaconda plan. People start realizing really quick, we're going to need these gunboats on the river. You have to change a lot of things in order to do that. And above all, you have to hire more sailors. A U.S. naval lieutenant, who I believe was from Michigan, basically wrote to the Secretary of the Navy and put forward the idea in August of 1861 that if we're creating an entirely new squadron to operate in Western waters, why don't we actually hire sailors from Western waters? The Great Lakes sailing season will be ending in a couple of months, and there will be a lot of Great Lakes and canal boatmen in Michigan and Illinois and Wisconsin who could be hired. Lord knows the war's only going to last 3 or 4 months. You might as well have a job over the winter, right? And so he proposes for the first time U.S. naval recruiting rendezvous be placed at Louisville, at St. Louis, Detroit, and Chicago. This is a piece from the Tribune. Water Street is what we now know as Wacker Drive. So right there at the corner of Wacker Drive in LaSalle was where the U.S. Navy recruiting depot was. And they also began recruiting for the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps was incredibly tiny. They predominantly only did shipboard, essentially security detail, should the sailors become mutinous. And then occasionally, if there was to be a landing party, generally about 10 Marines would go with the 60 sailors who went ashore, and they would do that. It's a very new thing. This is partly what, again, turns the Marine Corps into what we know as an amphibious force. So going back to what I mentioned at the beginning and my brain going down multiple research rabbit holes, this is a copy of the very first week that the U.S. recruiting depot at Chicago was open. You'll note up at the top, this is not Chicago paperwork because that didn't exist. They sent them paperwork for Baltimore, hand scratched it out and rewrote it in. And this is from the first week of October 1861. And if you look, the way these forms were set up is that you would put the enlistee's name, you would put their age, you would put, it's hard to read here, where it's crossed out. It lists for general service or coastal survey. Basically, are you going to be a fighting sailor, or are you enlisting for essentially one academic expedition along a coast? And then this is scratched out and they replaced it Western Gunboat Fleet. And then you have where they're from, and then you have what is their occupation. And generally, when you go through, and I went through hundreds of these between 1861 and 64, basically all of them say sailor, 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 steward, cabin boy, sailor, 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 sailor. This is constantly, these are all those very same Great Lakes merchantmen, canal boatmen, etc., who are now coming to join the U.S. Navy. And of course, note their place of origin. Many of them wind up actually being from Chicago, but many more are the typical Chicago sailors of the time. They're Norwegians, they're Englishmen, they're Irishmen from various counties. You have Canadians from Nova Scotia. You've got men from Prussia, on and on and on. And as you go through, you see more and more detail of where they're from, what their experiences is. This is one from 1863. I should note that recruiting picks up heavily in the first few months of 1861 that it's open into 1862, and then it drops off rapidly. The word is now filtering back that this is not a cushy job. You are in an iron floating riverine gunboat that is constantly getting shot at, and it's not as fun, and the war is not going to be over in 4 months. However, in March of 1863, the United States Congress passes an order for conscription for the first time in our history. And now everyone is worried that they're going to be drafted into the Army. So instead, I'll go join the Navy, where the pay is $18 a month. This is from 1863, and I especially love this because you have a different recruiting officer who's writing it, and he puts a lot more information. For example, a reference here where it says, what is their prior service? It actually references a couple of men have 2 or 3 years prior service in the U.S. Navy, and several others are former sailors of the English Royal Navy for 3 years, for 4 years. There was another one actually I found. It's worth noting, this is filled out at the recruiting depot in Chicago. These men, once they've enlisted, they would be sent generally to Mound City or to Cairo, where they would then be outfitted. They would begin training. They would be sent on board a ship. There was no boot camp in those days. It was on the job training, but there was the general chance that men would desert en route. And so that actually happens a couple of times. I think there's one about 6 lines down where it mentions a guy deserted. But what they did to try to help counter this is you have to put out warrants if this guy is a desertee. So they began making note of their tattoos and defining features. And there's a lot of references to, a former sailor of the Royal Navy, where it's like he has a crown and a schooner tattooed across his back, and another guy has a Chinese dragon around his arm, and awesome things like that. Yes, sir.
Joe, if this is 1863, it says complexion dark. Do you think those are black sailors?
I don't think entirely. The Navy did actually have black sailors. It is possible, but generally in this day and age, if they reference someone as being black, they use the term black or Negro. That was generally what was always put. So I think the man may be, I mean, there's a lot of references to sailors, particularly like in the Royal Navy, that they spend a lot of time in the East Indies and they become quite tan. They would list them as dark complexion. So there are a lot of references actually. The Navy didn't segregate as much, but you also have the issue that these fleets are operating oftentimes in the deep South, and you actually do have accounts of slaves escaping to these Army and Navy units. And unfortunately, there's a lot of accounts where they would basically be pressed into service as laborers, either digging ditches, trenches, fortifications, or shoveling coal. So basically continuing to use them for labor. But that was the time. And so out of this, you have an entire new set of U.S. Navy men. My friends Alec Burcham and Myers Brown there on the right, modeling the latest in 1860s nautical fashion for you. You have a whole slew now of men from the Western states, men who grew up on and around canals and rivers who are now operating in these rivers. You still have an officer class that is primarily from the East Coast. They're primarily of the old school ocean-going mindset, but there becomes a whole new, how do I say, prevalence for what's the word? For officers with daring. Basically, anyone who has a go-get 'em attitude. We talk about Admiral Farragut famously, shouting "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead" as he's sailing into the harbor in New Orleans. And the gentleman right there in the front with the fantastic beard, that would be Admiral Porter. Admiral Porter would command the Western Gunboat Squadron from late 1862 until the end of the war. Again, was a very good friend with William Sherman. Together, they operated very well. Same way with General Grant. And Lincoln himself insisted that Porter maintain command because of his aggressive attitude. His idea basically was that if you have a puddle, I will take my fleet there, no matter where it is. And so, of course, these accounts and what these men go through filter back occasionally. I can't include every story, but one of my favorites was a telegram from 1863 from a U.S. Naval quartermaster to the Secretary of the Navy's office in D.C. And basically, this is in St. Louis, and it's part of the gunboat fleet, and it's several, I think it was 4 men on the USS Carondelet who insisted that they had been enlisted in Chicago in 1861 and that they had been told that they were enlisting for either 3 years or the war. It's now 1863, 3 years is up, and I want to go home. And basically this quartermaster officer is writing to see if that stipulation was actually in the papers that they signed. It was not. So this is happening all the time. This is an account, like I mentioned, of the Seamen's Benevolent Society. This is from, it's from the Tribune in March of 1862. So there's a lot of these throughout 62, 63, right after Fort Henry and Donelson, right after Memphis and Island Number 10, and after Vicksburg. There are a lot of accounts, again, of many of these sailors were killed. Many of these ironclads were punctured by shot. You have like an entire gun crew gets killed, or a boiler does explode, etc. This is still a bloody action, not just we often think of the Army as getting decimated periodically. The Navy is also feeling the hits. There on the right, you have the U.S. gunboat Essex. The Essex was one of the largest of these gunboats that was actually built. It wasn't a city-class gunboat. It was actually one of Mr. Eads' submarine ships, his salvage ships, that was redesigned, fitted with armor, and a giant 100-pound rifled cannon on its bow. This will come back later. Porter's idea of using this thing was basically whenever the entire fleet is going up a tributary, this ship will lead, so that if we round the corner of a river and we find a Confederate gunboat against us, this is the bigger boat with the bigger gun, and it can take it out. To me, this is rather hilarious because a lot of the places that Porter, no matter his bravado, a lot of the places they sent these boats it's hairy. There's one case where, in an effort to take Vicksburg, Mississippi, they managed to get the gunboats south of the guns of Vicksburg. They do this in the middle of the night. They strapped coal barges to the port side of the ships as extra armor. Then they basically shut off the boilers so they could drift by without exposing themselves. And they put extra armor on the sides by nailing railroad rails onto the outside of the ship as extra armor. They get several of these boats south of Vicksburg, and then the plan is to somehow get these boats up the Yazoo River into the basin and come up around Vicksburg. They do this by blasting a hole in the levee. And then basically riding the wave through into the swamp. The USS Carondelet at one point is going up a river. The Confederates are chopping down trees in its front to block it. So sailors are on the front of the bow of these ships with axes and saws, clearing away trees as they go. And there's barely 4 feet of clearance on either side. At one point, Porter actually thought he was going to have to scuttle 3 of his ships, and he ordered the sailors to, and I quote, cover the outside of the iron with swamp slime to make it harder for a boarding party to climb up. And he ordered essentially scuttle charges placed just in case. And then if needs be, we'll scuttle the boats and hoof it through the swamps and hopefully make it back. They didn't have to do that, thankfully. But that was a plan. There's a lot of these wacky 19th century engineering ideas for these problems. They're digging canals, trying to divert rivers. There's one occasion where they're moving through a cypress swamp in northern Louisiana, and they actually fitted a boat with a large underwater buzz saw to cut trees off at the roots so the fleets could then follow behind. A lot of this is happening. To go back to another Chicago story, I mentioned the Marine Corps. So this is a detachment of ships, Marine detachment, circa about 1860, in full dress. So that recruiting ad that I showed earlier, if you'll notice, the name of the recruiting officer was a Second Lieutenant Frank Church. Frank Church of Church Street, Frank. Frank Church, his father was an alderman of the city of Chicago, was a wealthy businessman. He joined the U.S. Marine Corps in 1862, was commissioned as second lieutenant, initially was set up to be a recruiting officer. We need Marines, etc. After that, he gets promoted to first lieutenant, and he is put in charge of the Marine detachment on board the USS Blackhawk. The USS Blackhawk was Admiral Porter's flagship and his pride and joy. He comes into this position in early 1864, just in time for what becomes known as the Red River Campaign. This was, and the best way I can describe this operation is failure. But it's fun to read about. So the Red River is a major tributary of the Mississippi, and it basically flows from eastern Texas through Shreveport, Louisiana, on down past Alexandria, Louisiana, and in the very center of the state, and then on down into the Mississippi. So this is a plan that initially, it's a good plan, but like many, the best laid plans of mice men and General William Sherman, doesn't always get executed properly. So William Sherman and Admiral Porter, who again were very good friends, come up with this idea. Again, remember back to the beginning. If we're going to control the river and split the South in half, you have to take out its pieces. We've taken Vicksburg. We're moving in on the eastern side. What about Louisiana, Texas, and Arkansas? That has to be dealt with as well. The idea is for the Army and the Navy to work together to push up this corridor of the Red River through Louisiana and eventually invade Texas. Part of the reason why this is proposed is William Tecumseh Sherman, prior to the war, was the head superintendent of a military school just across the river from Alexandria, Louisiana. That school will later on be moved and will become known as Louisiana State University, LSU. Sherman actually resigns his post to go north with the outbreak of war. He knows this country well. He knows the river well. And he tells Porter the general rules of how this river flows, when it's high, when it's low, etc., what you can do. And they come up with this plan together. And then at the last minute, the War Department in Washington basically tells Sherman, you're not going. We need you in the East, in Georgia, in Savannah. He'd already done his march on Atlanta. We need you to do more. Instead, we like the plan. We're giving the Army command to a General Nathan Banks. Banks, very short version. Banks was a political officer. He was an idiot, and he had no respect for the Navy. And in turn, Porter hated his guts. So you can see how this is already going wrong. The initial plan is for the Army in 3 separate columns to converge on Alexandria, Louisiana, while the entirety of Porter's gunboat fleet makes its way up the Red River. They get all the way to Alexandria, and Admiral Porter initially arrives there first, and he is aggravated that Banks is not there with his troops on schedule. And then he takes a look around him, and what he sees is a southern city that's pretty much untouched, not necessarily untouched by war, but its agriculture remains the same. And what he sees are, first of all, a lot of bales of really valuable cotton. Now, when you think of naval warfare in the 17 and 1800s, and you think about like master and commander and these various things, when you're fighting against other ships and other navies, a major part of this is not just sinking and burning the enemy ships. It's taking them as a prize. Ships are expensive. Ships are good. You don't want to waste and you don't want to destroy this thing. You want to take it and use it. That's how the Navy paid a lot of their sailors and their officers, was you would capture a ship, it would be brought back, it would be sold, and that bounty would be paid out to those sailors. So Admiral Porter takes a look around and he thinks to himself, we are technically on a naval operation here, and there's a lot of really valuable stuff. So he sends armed groups of shore parties of sailors to capture this Confederate bales of cotton, where they're then strapped on the boats. And when we get back, they are registered as official naval prizes with the federal court in Springfield, Illinois. This entire operation, though it fails, is very profitable for the U.S. Navy. I should also mention this eventually leads to the burning of Alexandria, Louisiana, which my wife is in the audience. That is her hometown. She has thoroughly enjoyed me talking about this. Basically, the Army finally arrives. Banks is an idiot. He wanders around. He eventually loses a battle with Confederate troops and immediately retreats back to Alexandria, scrubs the whole idea. All while this is happening, Porter is unable to get his ships any further, really past. There's about 2 bayous that are past Alexandria, and he can't get his boats further on. The Confederates have dammed it up. They took a steamboat and they turned it sideways and sank it in the river, making a dam. And because of this dam, the river is falling. It should be rising. It's the springtime. It's falling. Porter doesn't entirely know why, but he keeps looking at the rapids of Rapides Parish right there next to Alexandria, and those rocks are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And he starts thinking, I'm going to lose my entire fleet if we don't head back to the Mississippi. And they wind up being saved by Colonel Samuel Bailey, a Wisconsin lumberjack who is there at the command of a volunteer Wisconsin infantry unit. As a lumberjack, he knew about building dams and he knew about floating things down rivers. And so he takes his soldiers, a bunch of Wisconsin lumberjacks, they fell a bunch of cypress trees and they build a dam just below the rapids there at Alexandria, and they let the water rise above it. And once again, I kid you not, they stack up the gunboat, the entire fleet. And those are those massive city class ironclads, by the way. And then they stack them up in a line, and then they blow the dam and ride the wave out. And with that, the U.S. Navy gunboat fleet is saved to once again fight another day. They make it back to the Mississippi, and there you go. A lot of these accounts actually come from Lieutenant Frank Church's journal. It's one of the few actual diaries that we have of someone who served in the Western Gunboat Fleet. And of course, specifically, he was a Chicagoan, and he made a point that he would run into sailors or other officers that he knew from Chicago, makes reference, I had dinner with so-and-so. He, of course, also makes reference while he's in Alexandria. He goes and pays social calls to the various socialites of the city, various houses, various families, etc. And he gives us a fantastic account of this disastrous, though hilariously funny expedition. Yep, good on time. With that, I have one more piece here. Now, the war will end in 1865, as we all know. The Western Gunboat Fleet pays a huge part of this, and particularly in victory in the West. Without this, the capture of Vicksburg, without taking Memphis, without the control of these rivers, including and of course its mouth at New Orleans, the war easily could have lasted a lot longer, or in general could have been fought to a stalemate. There's no, like all counterfactuals, there's no way of knowing exactly how bad it would have gone had you not had this fleet that was created in such a small amount of time and all of the Midwest sailors that manned it. That being said, there's a lot of fun things that come out of it. I've just discussed several of them. This is a document that I came across in the official records of the Union and Confederate navies. And while it doesn't talk about the gunboat fleet, it does talk a little bit about Chicago and Chicago's importance. Now, I fully intended this to be like the final cherry on top of this talk, if anyone was still awake for it. And I was planning to read this to you verbatim in my thickest Alabama accent. But I think what would be better if I simply describe it. So essentially, this was a letter, an honest letter that was sent by a Lieutenant Murdoch to Jefferson Davis himself. And basically what it proposes is his plan to stick a knife in the back of the United States. His plan is three, and I quote, he mentions the three officers that will accompany him. So I like to call this Lieutenant Murdoch and his dudes, who basically propose, if you will give us $100,000 in gold, you can see already this is a problem, we will go to Canada, where we will acquire a ship. From there, we will sail to Erie, Pennsylvania, where we will find the USS Michigan, which at that time was the only U.S. naval warship in the Great Lakes. All the other ships have been set for blockading duty. The plan is to arrive in the port at roughly 1 a.m. We will moor alongside her, and then we will take her by storm. Once we have seized this warship, we will begin commerce raiding in the Great Lakes, burning and sinking every Yankee ship we can find. We will shell the port of Erie. We will shell the port of Detroit. Then we will, that's the quote, we will sail to Chicago and there burn the locks of the Illinois and Michigan Canal, putting them out of service. He apparently had no idea that you have to go through every bridge in the city to get there. And I have this wonderful idea that if this actually happened, that they would let them get through and then just lock them in between two bridges and have essentially the 1860s version of the Capone gang simply fire at them from the riverbank. This is what lives in my head. From there, we will sail to Milwaukee, shell the port, and having destroyed all American commerce on the Great Lakes, we will then scuttle our ship and escape into Canada. This gets approved. Look, Jefferson Davis tells his Secretary of the Treasury, give them the money, let's make this happen. The next day, presumably, everyone sobers up and they remind President Davis that, sir, let's just assume this will work. If it works, the Canadians will be incredibly angry at us. If the Canadians are incredibly angry, the British will be incredibly angry, and we kind of need the British to be on our side. So they stop the order for the allocation of funds, and they reply to Lieutenant Murdoch, sorry, but we don't think it'll actually work. Therefore, head done. But the letter is still there in the archives, and to me, if nothing else, it shows the importance of the Great Lakes, of Chicago, not only truly as a great port, but also in the eye of the Confederates, that this is a focal point of the U.S. war effort. So with that, anyone have any questions? Yes, sir.
From the Chicago Tribune regarding a Seamen's Benevolent Society fellow that died.
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed in there that it was the church where the services were to be conducted where it was at Indiana and Franklin.
Yeah.
Now,
Streets.
now, some of those streets probably changed names since then. You know where they is located.
I've not looked it up. I could try to find, this is of course, let's see, this is 62. So this is 9 years before the Great Chicago Fire. And of course, after the fire, some of those streets do get renamed, et cetera. And even, you know, some of the layouts get changed, but I can try to find out for you.
There's. Indiana starts first. It would be downtown, it would be in the lake downtown. Currently, yeah.
Right. The, what you call it? In 18, let's see, it's 1850. I think it's 1850. The southern boundary of Chicago was at 22nd Street. So by 1860, they're probably down. I want to say they're down. They're not as far as here at 35th. Bridgeport exists. I don't think it was completely incorporated into the city by that point, but well, there you go. But you're getting close. So.
Look it up and you'll have to repeat this for the recording later. It's Franklin in Illinois. It's today, the answer.
Okay, so there you go. It's at Franklin in Illinois. Yes, sir.
So you took us through the river battles. Is this the same like the USS Cairo at Fort Pillow outside of Memphis at the same island and same area? You know about that battle in USS Cairo.
So the USS Cairo is involved at the Battle of Memphis, and they're at Fort, well, partly off of Fort Pillow and Island Number 10. That is before the Red River. So the Red River expedition is the last hurrah, if you will, of the gunboat fleet. That takes place in 1864. The Battle of Memphis, if you can envision, Vicksburg is the big focal point that's taken in July of 1863, and they're trying to take it in the fall of 62 and spring of 63. Memphis has to be taken first because it's north. And so Memphis is primarily taken in late summer of 1862. That's where these operations take place. Spring of 1862, the fleet is brand new. It gets blooded at Forts Henry, Fort Donelson, and then you move down the actual Mississippi proper, and you get Battles of Island Number 10, which is essentially the main fortification north of Memphis. And then you have the naval battle off of Memphis, and then Memphis falls to Army troops shortly thereafter.
And so this is the first battle in Cairo in 1862, and it's not until 1864 we got the Red River campaign.
Correct. Yeah. And the Cairo was sank in, I believe it was late 63. I mentioned the time where they blew a hole in the levee and went into the Yazoo River Basin. So the Cairo was sunk by a mine. It lost no hands. The ship sank. It's actually, it's an incredible piece of archaeology because it sank in the mud. Everyone was able to get off. It sank relatively quickly, but enough that everyone was still able to get off. But they left everything behind. And so when it sank into the mud, that was preserved. So I mean, you have, of course, the guns, you've got effects like far better than even what they have with the Lady Elgin. There are leather goods like shoes and boots. A good friend of mine, Dr. Peter Cash, actually used to volunteer at that museum. And when he was a volunteer there, he told me the story that they were moving some things out to clean. And he was allowed basically to help the curator. He picked up an original cap tally, a ribbon that had USS Cairo printed in gold embroidery on it, and that this thing was so incredibly fragile, and he was worried to death that it would fall apart on him. So it is an incredible piece of an archaeological find from the 1960s. There's a great book called Hard Luck Ironclad that was written by Dr. Bierce back in the 1960s about that operation. But yes, sir. Hopefully I answered your question.
Yeah, it did.
Yes, ma'am. Basically, the U.S. Navy downsizes after the war. We kept a lot of the ships that we built were for that immediate use. There were a lot of steamboats that were purchased. They get turned back into civilian ships. There were coastal monitors that were built, that a couple were kept for coastal defense, but the rest we don't need. It's the classic deal of having a large Navy is expensive. We don't need it. Let's get rid of it. So they simply get scrapped, every last one of them. So the Cairo and its remnants are the only thing that we have left of those. Yes, sir.
What's the extent of?
I don't know the exact amount. Part of that is actually because even though you do get a lot of officers who do well, the Army and the Navy still don't like to talk to each other, and they both like to have command. So I didn't go into this a ton because it gets worked out. But in the early years, this entire gunboat fleet, the officers and sailors are of the U.S. Navy. The guns are provided by the U.S. Navy. The ships and the entire operation is considered part of the U.S. Army. And so the Army, because it's a river, right? It's not a naval area, therefore it's an Army thing. And there's a whole back and forth about who owns what and how does it go. And because of that, you have certain ships that are considered Army property, and you have other ships that are considered naval vessels with great naval documentation. And then eventually everything is sort of handed over to the Navy, but then you have all of these support vessels. So the best I can tell you is that there were 9 city-class ironclads that were built. You had anywhere from a dozen to about 30 tin-clads and light wooden armored vessels. There was the weirdly named Mississippi Marine Brigade, which was neither Marine nor was it a brigade, but was a fleet of ram ships that was privately paid for by a Louisville merchant, if you will, and he captained each of the boats with his sons and nephews and cousins, and basically formed a weird semi-army, semi-navy thing. And then you had a whole host of weird transport vessels. And even those mortar rafts, half the time those were manned by Army artillerymen with these siege mortars. So there's a lot of just ambiguity over who owns what, and therefore the entire catalog of the fleet never shows up in one person's paperwork. Admiral Porter tried his best to always keep them together because with a fleet, like, togetherness is firepower. There were occasions where that was not possible, such as during the Yazoo. When they blast that hole in the levee and they float in, the bayou goes off in multiple directions, and you have creeks and streams and lakes and things. And the idea is that every single one of them could have a Confederate ironclad that could, be a menace. So we have to cover all the bases. And so oftentimes, imagine you're going up a river, there's a tributary here. I send an ironclad up to reconnoiter, go another mile upstream. Here's another tributary, send another. So as you go deeper into the interior, you're losing more and more of your ships while you're guarding your rear. So, yeah.
Saw this like
Mhm.
and it strikes me that it's sort of a logical way to design one of these things. Not so much a coincidence, but with the modern Merrimack, you have all the attention. These are the ironclad. This is the beginning, and they're not at all the beginning of it, but they're signaling, I guess.
Mhm.
How is it that these things at the notice?
Part of that, my personal opinion as to why, the Battle of Hampton Roads gets so much more, more press over the generations is, if nothing else, the entire Eastern theater of the Civil War gets more press. When you think of a Civil War battle, you think of Gettysburg, you think of Antietam, you think of Fredericksburg. These all happen in Virginia. Tennessee is the second most fought over state after Virginia. Vicksburg, Fort Donelson, Fort Pillow, all of these actions take place. Without Vicksburg, the Confederacy loses, and New Orleans for that matter, they lose the Mississippi, they lose their interior. That's what breaks their back. That's what gives Grant his reputation. That's what allows him to take over as the overall commander. But because those are far away from Washington, D.C., which is constantly with a knife at its throat, it's less important. That's the thing that's happening in the behind the scenes. Kind of like when you think of World War II, everyone thinks of D-Day, not North Africa, not Sicily, not Italy. Those are the forgotten campaigns that did a lot of the early legwork to make this later thing possible. So in the same vein, when you talk about Hampton Roads, like, if nothing else, there's so much romance to it. The Merrimack is this great U.S. naval vessel that is scuttled and burned, and it only half burns to the waterline. And the gallant Confederates, depending on your perspective, raise this thing and then through their ingenuity build the first ironclad. It wasn't the first ironclad. The French and the British had done it before, but the U.S. has to counter. And they have this wild and weird Swedish engineer who comes up with, of all things, a cheese box on a raft with the first naval spinning turret that is its answer. And the two have this wild dance of steel, iron, and guns. It goes great for the papers, right? Versus you've got a bunch of boats with railroad rails strapped to the side that are covered in swamp slime going through creeks. And it's in many ways, this is the 19th century. What is fashionable here is the romance of war, as unromantic as it may be. And what you see in the West is hot, muggy swamp weather with guys being shot at constantly going up weird rivers in Mississippi. The working part of, as to quote one of the greatest book titles I know of, Uncle Abraham's Brownwater Navy. So yeah, it maybe, but hopefully we'll change that. Yes, sir.
I think also its ability to start attacking the blockade, right? So if the blockade is all wooden vessels, largely sail powered, this is an existential threat to the whole blockade if it had succeeded, right? So that's what makes it such a great yarn for reporters.
It's always that what could have been.
Yeah, exactly.
You mentioned that it seemed to be better as cities.
Mhm.
There were, they had their own-
There were several that were being built. One of the big things is that the Confederacy, as we all know, the North had a far greater industrial power. You can mill iron a lot easier in the North and create than you could in the South. So they're having to ration these things. So the Confederacy did actually design several interior ironclads, but by and large, they do realize that we can't, and they rely on those quick, fast, light ram ships or simply riverine defense. Although I will mention, again, when I was doing this research, one of the things is I combed every newspaper as well as the National Archives for anything tying to Chicago. And one thing that I found was it was a telegram sent to the Naval Department in D.C. In 1862. And this was from a concerned citizen staying at the Tremont Hotel in Chicago, basically saying that there was a young lady was staying at the hotel and that she had been living as a school teacher in Louisiana until the barbarous Confederates began taking over. And so she fled back to the North and she's hoping to get home. But her story that she would tell anyone who listened is that I believe it was in Baton Rouge, she witnessed the Confederates building, and I quote, an infernal submarine menace, which to me is the coolest rock band name I've ever heard. What she's referring to is what will become the H.L. Hunley. The Hunley was built in Louisiana. So there is a lot of experimentation with craft. And also submarine didn't always mean something that went underwater, but often something that was, again, that did not go underwater, but that used underwater munitions, basically like a mine that you could push forward and detonate. So like when there's references to the Cairo being exploded, they don't say mine, they say it was blown up by a submarine. So. Yes, ma'am. It's in the hundreds. I'm not, how do I say? I've gone through like each one. I've gone through 1861, October to July of 1863 of the enlistment records. And of those, you also have to parse like how many, if you're counting how many are actually born Chicagoans or how many simply enlist at Chicago. That's kind of the ambivalent thing, but it could range anywhere from say 60 to several hundred, and I'm not completely done yet. And then you also have officers, and then I don't have the records, the enlistment records for the Marine Corps. Frank Church, obviously I know he must have recruited some. How many? I don't entirely know. So that is to go later. Like I said, this is still the early phases. I started researching this project about August of last year. So as it gets going, hopefully I'll have something definitive to publish. So Yes, sir.
You mentioned that need for church.
Mhm.
Seems to me it was the name of Ohio, Watergate. I don't know.
It might have been. Might have been a relation. I don't know. Was there another one in the back, I think? Or, yes. No, generally most all of them are paddle wheel steamers. So, you can actually see on this photo of the Essex here. That is an armor covering for its paddle wheel. Let me go back to the Cairo here. The City class ironclads, you can see it back here. They were all designed to have 4 boilers and one very large stern paddle wheel. Most all riverine vessels at this time were paddle wheel designed because, again, of the draft. A big issue is if these rivers change, you've got sandy bottoms, all these sorts of things that could stir you up. And actually, at one point, Admiral Farragut, after he had taken New Orleans, actually brought his screw sloops, that is propeller driven, up the Mississippi to help at Vicksburg. He lost 2 of them to gunfire because these are all just made out of wood. And one of those, in an effort to get away from the gunfire, ran aground and lost its propeller and had to be pulled off by one of the City class ironclads. So as a general, they just realized that what's best is a paddle wheel design, but you have to armor the paddle wheel because otherwise, if it gets shot away, you are quite literally dead in the water. Yes, sir. The City class ironclads, if I remember correctly, with artillery and fully loaded, their draft was about 10 feet, which for something of that size was not bad. Yes, sir.
We had like gun complement.
For each city class, it varied depending on the time. But you can see here on the Cairo, you generally had 3. You had 3 gun ports on the bow, and those would generally be your heaviest. In the early war, they outfit them with 42-pound Parrott rifles, and then later on, you're getting bigger and bigger guns that put on, such as that one on the Essex that was, I think it was a 102-pounder. And you also have several large smoothbore Napoleons. A lot of them were placed on the sides. A lot of the times they plan to to face forwards because the river is moving. So you had to plan with, like, if we are moving with the flow, because you're coming south with the flow, if you're coming forward, you want to be able to steam backwards if possible, and you want your face towards the enemy. So if you engage the enemy on the sides, it's going to be, much like this, where everyone is swirling around and you're firing at literally point blank range. So, but generally each would have 3 on either side. You would have numerous small arms. The soldiers often get shot at by snipers from the riverbanks. This is actually really common. There's actually quite a few ship commanders that get killed because it's hot and you want to breathe. So you go up on deck and then some guy from Louisiana takes a pot shot at you. It's like it happens. Yes, sir. That I can find. It's the first true maritime sailors union. The idea of them let's see, go back to this reference. The Seamen's Benevolent Society gets incorporated in, I believe it's February of 1860. And you pay dues of $5 a year. With that, basically, one of the first issues that leads to this is that you have Great Lakes sailors who sign on for a voyage. Like, let's say I'm going to haul grain from Chicago to Buffalo, and the ship's captain, ship owner, tells you will get paid X amount for this voyage. So you get on the ship and you sail for 5 days, however long, and you arrive in Buffalo, New York, and then the captain gives you half of that. And he says, well, we agreed on this other. Yeah, but that was official paperwork in the state of Illinois. You're in New York now. Here you go. And this was a problem. And so the idea, as with all things, workers need rights. You band together and you make sure that happens. The other thing was, being a sailor on the Great Lakes can be a dangerous business, as we all know. And so the idea is that if you do die, and you remember, the society would pay stipends to look after your widow and children if you were married and had children. Also, while you were in the Port of Chicago, they had actually they had rooms and lodging that you could stay at, essentially a union hall. They would host regular meetings, functions, and lectures. So by all accounts, thus they're the best of what I could find, the first Maritime Sailors Union. Unfortunately, I don't know exactly how long they lasted. They leave the newspaper public record in 1868, and I haven't delved that deep into the city archives yet. So we'll see. With that, I believe I'm over by 10 minutes. Thank you guys for putting up with me, coming out, and I'll be here to take any questions if you got.
Joe, thank you very much. I think I speak for all of us and Abraham Lincoln when I say thank you. That was fantastic. You all have a little bit more time now to explore the museum and look around. Thank you for everyone who joined online. Thank you for everyone who joined in person. I now free you to go look around, enjoy the museum, go track down Joe with the rest of your ironclad questions. Thanks, everybody.